small town in Germany. 23,000 people, and a hatred so deep, so personal, so completely all-consuming, that it divided an entire community for 70 years. Not politics, not religion, shoes. This is the story of two brothers who built two of the most powerful brands in the history of sport, and destroyed each other in the process. And the man from Oregon with $35 and a waffle iron, who walked into their war and won. It is 1919, Herzogenaurach, Bavaria. A 19-year-old boy is standing in his mother's laundry room surrounded by scraps of leather and second-hand tools. His name is Adolf Dassler. Everyone calls him Adi. His family has nothing. His town has nothing. Germany has just lost a world war and the entire country is on its knees. But Adi Dassler is not thinking about any of that. He is thinking about one question. How do you make an athlete faster? He has been obsessing over this question since he was a child, watching sprinters, watching footballers, watching the way a foot hits the ground and asking, what is the shoe doing wrong? That day in the laundry room, with war-rationed leather and tools that barely worked, he made his first sports shoe. It was extraordinary, not because it was perfect, it wasn't, but because it was the physical proof of an obsession that would change the world. His brother Rudolf saw what Adi was building and made a decision. He was in. Where Adi was quiet and technical, spending hours adjusting a single stitch, obsessing over the angle of a spike, Rudolf was the opposite. Loud, magnetic. The kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with every single one of them convinced he was their best friend. Adi made the shoes. Rudolf sold them. In 1924, the Dassler brothers' shoe factory was born. And for 12 years, it worked. Until 1936. Until Berlin. Until Jesse Owens. The Berlin Olympics were supposed to be Adolf Hitler's greatest propaganda triumph, a global showcase for Aryan racial supremacy. A black American athlete from Alabama had other ideas. Jesse Owens was the fastest man on earth, and Adi Dassler had spent weeks trying to get him into his shoes. He found Owens in the Olympic Village and made his pitch. Owens said yes. What happened next stopped the world. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. 4 in Hitler's stadium, under Hitler's flags, in front of Hitler's face, and on his feet, spikes made in a laundry room in Bavaria by a carpenter's son with an obsession. The Dassler brothers' shoe factory became famous overnight, but the glory didn't last, because the war came, and the war broke everything. What happened between Adi and Rudolf during World War II has been argued over for decades. The details are disputed, the full truth is buried with both of them. What is not disputed is this: at some point during those years, in the chaos and fear and paranoia of wartime Germany, Rudolf became convinced that his own brother had informed on him to the Nazi authorities, that Adi had deliberately had him conscripted into military service. Adi denied it. Rudolf never believed him. And something that could never be unsaid, never be unfelt, opened between them, a wound that would never close. In 1948, it became official. The Dassler brothers' shoe factory was dissolved. Rudolf picked up and crossed the river Aurach, the small river that cuts through the center of Herzogenaurach, and built his own factory on the other side. He called his company Puma. Adi stayed. He called his company Adidas, ADI, Das. His name, his shoes, his life. And from that morning, the town of Herzogenaurach went to war. Not metaphorically. Every single person in that town was forced to choose Adidas or Puma, Adi's side or Rudolf's side. Employees of one company did not speak to employees of the other. Adidas families did not marry Puma families. If you walked into a shop and the owner saw your shoes, the wrong shoes, the conversation was over before it started. There was a phrase the townspeople used for anyone who hadn't declared a side. They called them bent necks, because you could always tell which company someone worked for by watching which direction they looked when a stranger walked past. They were looking at the shoes. In Herzogenaurach, the shoes on your feet were a declaration of war, and across the Atlantic, someone was watching. His name was Phil Knight. He was a runner, a decent middle-distance athlete from Oregon, nothing spectacular, but he had a question. He was studying at Stanford Business School, and he wrote a paper for an entrepreneurship class. The paper asked, could a small American company import high-quality Japanese running shoes and take on the German giants, Adidas and Puma, that owned the American market? His professor gave him a B. Phil Knight decided to find out if his professor was wrong. In 1962, he flew to Japan with almost no money and walked into the offices of a shoe company called Onitsuka Tiger. He had no company, no contacts, no credibility. He told them he represented a company called Blue Ribbon Sports. Blue Ribbon Sports did not exist. He made it up. On the spot. In the meeting. The Japanese executives, charmed by this earnest young American who clearly believed every word he was saying, agreed to send him samples. Phil Knight flew home and started selling shoes out of the trunk of his car at track meets. He made $8,000 his first year. He kept going. His old college coach Bill Bowerman joined him, a man so obsessed with making shoes lighter and faster that one Sunday morning he poured liquid rubber into his wife's waffle iron. He was trying to create a better sole. His wife was not pleased, but the waffle sole, one of the greatest innovations in the history of athletic footwear, was born at a breakfast table in Oregon. In 1971 they needed a new name. An employee had a dream about Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. They paid a design student $35 to create a logo. She drew a curved shape she called a swoosh.
Knight looked at it and said, "I don't love it, but it'll grow on me."
He had absolutely no idea. In 1972, Nike entered the market. Adidas had Jesse Owens, Olympic gold medals, 30 years of dominance. Nike had a waffle iron and a $35 logo. And then Phil Knight made a bet that everyone told him was insane. He went after athletes, not shops, not advertising budgets, not distribution networks, athletes. The logic was simple, and it was radical. If the greatest athletes in the world wear Nike, if the people who define what greatness looks like are seen in the swoosh, then everyone who wants to be great will follow. Adidas thought the product was everything. Nike understood something deeper. The story around the product is worth more than the product itself. In 1984, they made the most consequential signing in the history of sport. A 21-year-old rookie from North Carolina, Michael Jordan. Jordan wanted Adidas. Adidas wasn't interested enough to make a serious offer. Nike offered him something nobody had ever offered an athlete before. His own shoe line. A share of the profits. Not an endorsement. A partnership. Jordan was skeptical. His mother told him to take the meeting. He took the meeting. Nike projected first-year Air Jordan sales of $3 million. They made $126 million. In 1 year. From one shoe. From one athlete. From one meeting that almost didn't happen. Adidas watched from Germany and didn't fully understand what had hit them. They were still thinking about the shoe. Nike had moved on to something more powerful. The mythology. The idea that pulling on a pair of Air Jordans connected you, physically, spiritually, aspirationally, to the greatest basketball player who had ever lived. That idea was worth $126 million in year one. It was worth billions over the decades that followed. By the 1990s, Nike had overtaken Adidas as the most valuable sportswear brand on earth. And the brothers, Rudolf Dassler died in 1974. Adi Dassler died in 1978. They never spoke again after the split, not once in 30 years. They are buried in the same cemetery in Herzogenaurach, at opposite ends. As far apart in death as they chose to be in life, the hatred outlasted them both. For decades after their deaths, their families continued the feud. Adidas employees still didn't drink in Puma bars. Puma children still didn't date Adidas children. It wasn't until 2009, over 60 years after the brothers split, that the two companies organized a symbolic football match between their employees, a gesture of reconciliation, in the town that their feud had divided for 3 generations. Today, Adidas generates over $22 billion in revenue. Nike generates over $51 billion. Puma, Rudolph's company, generates around $9 billion. 3 companies, 2 brothers, 1 man with a waffle iron, and the entire world of sport was built in the space between them. So, what is the lesson? The first lesson is about obsession. Adi Dassler made his first shoe in a laundry room with scraps, not because anyone asked him to, not because there was a market opportunity, because he could not stop thinking about how to make an athlete faster. That obsession, that refusal to accept that the shoe was good enough, is the foundation of everything Adidas became. The companies that change the world are almost always built by people who couldn't help themselves, who were going to do the thing regardless of whether it made sense. The second lesson is about what hatred costs. If Adi and Rudolph had stayed together, the combined Dassler company might have been too dominant, too entrenched, too powerful for a startup from Oregon to find a foothold. We will never know, because they chose the wound over the win. They chose being right over being successful, and in the space created by their hatred, Phil Knight built the most valuable sportswear company in history. And the third lesson is about the bet. Nike signing Michael Jordan was not the obvious move. Jordan wanted Adidas. Basketball wasn't Nike's world, the risk was enormous, but Knight made the bet, and that one decision, made in a conference room in 1984 by a man who had started his company selling shoes from the trunk of a car, changed sport, changed business, changed culture. In business, the decisions that change everything never look like world-changing decisions when you make them. They look like bets. They look like risks. They look like the kind of move that could destroy everything you've worked for. The companies that win are the ones that make the bet anyway. This has been the Boardroom Files. Subscribe, because the next story begins in an orphanage. A boy with no family, no money, no name that anyone remembered, who built the most prestigious, most desired, most obsessively coveted watch brand in the history of the world. A brand so powerful that today, over a century later, people wait years just to buy one. This is the story of Rolex, and it starts with nothing. We'll see you in the boardroom.